Be me, Trevor, 34, working as a paramedic, 12-hour shifts that rarely stay 12, highways at 3 a.m., apartments with no elevator, people at the worst moment of their lives looking at you like you might be the only solid object left in the room. You learn to listen. Not the soft romantic kind of listening people talk about online, the real kind. The kind where someone's voice tells you more than their words. Short breath, slurred speech, panic hiding under anger, a wife insisting her husband is fine while her hands shake around the phone, a kid saying his chest hurts but looking more scared than hurt. Listening is part of the job, but so is triage. You cannot treat every sound like an emergency. You have to know what matters, what is noise, what is fear, what is manipulation, what is pain, and what is just someone needing the room to orbit around them. That last part became important. I met Harper at a bookstore cafe on a rainy Tuesday. I had just finished a shift that involved 2 car accidents, one diabetic emergency, and a drunk guy who kept trying to explain cryptocurrency to me while bleeding from his eyebrow. I was exhausted, not sad, not dramatic, just empty in the way only fluorescent hospital lighting can make you empty. I stopped for coffee before going home because sleep felt too close and I needed a buffer. Harper was sitting at the long shared table near the window with a stack of books, a laptop, and a pen tucked behind her ear. She was 30, worked as a therapist in training, not fully licensed yet, finishing her supervised hours. She had curly dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and this calm, attentive way of looking at people that made you feel like you had said something meaningful even when you hadn't. I dropped my keys by accident. They skittered under her chair. She picked them up and said, "Long night?" I laughed. "Long everything." She smiled. Not the polite kind, the kind that pauses. We started talking. She asked what I did. I told her. She asked if the job made relationships hard. That was an unusually direct question for a stranger, but the way she asked made it feel natural. I said, "Only when people think tired means uncaring." She tilted her head. That sounds like a sentence with a story behind it. It did, but I wasn't ready to tell it. So I asked about her books. That was how she got me talking anyway. Harper was easy to talk to at first, almost dangerously easy. She listened with her whole face. Small nods, soft follow-up questions, no rushing, no checking her phone, no turning every answer back to herself. After years of dating women who treated my job like either a hero fantasy or an inconvenience, Harper felt different, grounded, patient, interested in the person behind the uniform. The first few months were good, really good. She understood irregular hours. She didn't get offended if I fell asleep during a movie. She knew not to ask for details about traumatic calls unless I offered. She made tea when I came over after night shifts and let silence exist without filling it. At least in the beginning, she called herself a feminist, and I didn't care. That word had never bothered me. I had worked with female paramedics who could lift, think, lead, and stay calm under pressure better than plenty of men. My first field training officer was a woman named Dana who taught me more about courage than any man had. Equality made sense to me. Competence made sense. Respect made sense. Harper's feminism started in a place I understood. She talked about women not being heard, doctors dismissing pain, men interrupting, partners treating emotional labor like a natural resource that refilled itself overnight. I had seen some of that. I had watched women in emergency rooms repeat symptoms 3 times before someone took them seriously. So when Harper said listening mattered, I agreed. I still agree. Listening matters. The problem was that listening slowly became obedience. At first, Harper asked me to be more emotionally present, fair. I could be closed off after shifts. Sometimes my mind stayed at work even when my body came home. She would tell me about her day and I would drift. Not because I didn't care, because my nervous system had spent 12 hours sorting real emergencies from possible death, and now someone was explaining a difficult seminar discussion about attachment styles. I tried. I really did. I put the phone away. I made eye contact. I asked questions. I repeated back what I heard. She appreciated it. At first, Then the standards changed. She said I was listening cognitively but not emotionally. So I asked what emotional listening looked like. She said if she had to explain it, that was part of the problem. I nodded like that made sense. It didn't. The phrase listen more began appearing everywhere. If I tried to solve a practical issue, I wasn't listening. If I only validated her feelings, I was parroting therapeutic language without embodied empathy. If I stayed quiet, I was disengaged. If I asked a question, I was interrogating. If I shared a related experience, I was centering myself. If I didn't share, I was making her feel alone. There was no right setting, only feedback. I started coming over after shifts and bracing myself before opening her door. Not because Harper was cruel all the tea, she wasn't. That would have made leaving simpler. She could be warm, affectionate, funny. She had a dry sense of humor that appeared unexpectedly. She remembered small things. She bought the brand of electrolyte packets I liked and kept them in her cabinet. She once sat with me for an hour after a pediatric call and didn't say a word, just kept her hand on my back. That version of her was real, but so was the other version, the one who treated every conversation like a session where I was the resistant client. Her friends made it worse, especially Callie. Callie was in the same therapy program, permanently exhausted, permanently certain, and spoke about men like a population she had diagnosed from a distance. Harper would come back from study groups with new vocabulary, attunement, somatic safety, patriarchal listening deficits, male emotional extraction, weaponized silence. I knew enough medical terminology to respect specialized language, but I also knew jargon could hide bad thinking. In our relationship, it often did. One night I got off shift late, 2 hours late. A rollover accident had backed up the highway. I had blood on my boots, sweat dried under my collar, and a headache behind my eyes that felt like a nail. I texted Harper that I was exhausted and going straight home. She replied, "Can you call me for 10 minutes? I had a hard day." I should have said no. I called. That was my mistake. She started telling me about a conflict with her supervisor. Apparently, the supervisor had challenged her interpretation of a client case and Harper felt invalidated. I listened. For 27 minutes, not 10. I asked questions. I said that sounded frustrating. I said it made sense she would feel exposed being corrected in front of others. Then I made the mistake. I said, "Do you think she may have been pushing you because it's training and not personal?" Silence, not peaceful silence, the kind that drops the temperature. Harper said very softly, "I needed you to listen, Trevor." I closed my eyes. "I am listening." "No, you're problem solving." I asked one question. "You shifted the focus from my emotional experience to defending another woman." I sat on the edge of my bed, still in uniform pants, too tired to defend myself. I said, "I'm not defending her. I'm asking if maybe there are two pieces to it." She said, "This is what I mean. You don't know how to hold space." Hold space. I had held pressure on gunshot wounds, held people's heads still after crashes, held a dying man's hand while his wife was still 15 minutes away. But apparently I could not hold space because I asked whether a supervisor's feedback might have had a training purpose. I apologized. She accepted after another 20 minutes of explaining the impact. I slept 4 hours. The next day on shift, I almost forgot a medication count because my brain was foggy. That scared me. Personal stress bleeding into emergency work is not romantic. It is dangerous. I started setting limits, small ones. If I was coming off a brutal shift, I said I couldn't do heavy talks. Harper called that preemptive emotional withdrawal. If I asked to schedule serious conversations for a day off, she said emotional needs don't operate on my work calendar. If I told her I needed quiet, she said quiet was a privilege men used to avoid accountability. The irony was that she demanded listening constantly but never seemed to hear me when I said I was at capacity. That was the first note I made in my head. She does not hear no when no comes from me. The second note came during dinner with her friends. It was Harper, Callie, another classmate named Nina, Nina's boyfriend Adam, and me. Adam worked in insurance and had the haunted look of a man who had learned to blink in agreement. The conversation turned to relationships. Callie said most men didn't actually listen to women. They waited for their turn to speak, or they listened for a way to fix, dismiss, or dominate. Harper nodded vigorously. Then she said, "I've been working with Trevor on this." Working with me, like I was a case study. I looked at her. She touched my arm under the table, a little warning squeeze. Callie asked what she meant. Harper smiled in that careful way people smile when they want to appear loving while criticizing you in public. She said, "He's trying, but he still defaults to solution mode. We're practicing deeper listening." Practicing. I said, "I listen for a living." Callie gave a sympathetic laugh. "Emergency listening isn't relational listening." I said, "Maybe, but it is listening." Harper's smile tightened. She said, "See, that's the defensiveness." The table went quiet for half a second, then everyone moved on. But I didn't. I sat there while they discussed male listening failures, my hand around a water glass, feeling something inside me close a little. Not slam shut, just close, 1 inch. The main conflict happened 2 weeks later. Harper had a bad week. A client dropped out of therapy. Her supervisor gave her more critical feedback. Callie was spiraling about a guy who had taken 6 hours to reply to a text. Harper absorbed all of it and brought it to me. Friday night, I came to her apartment after a shift. She had candles lit, but not in a romantic way, in a "we are creating a safe container" way. There was tea on the table, no TV, no music, just 2 chairs angled toward each other. I knew immediately that I had walked into a meeting. She said, "I want us to have an intentional conversation about listening." I still had my backpack over one shoulder. I said, "Can I shower first?" Her face fell, not anger, disappointment, worse. She said, "That response tells me a lot." I set the bag down. "Harper, I just worked 12 hours, and I'm asking for connection. I smell like ambulance and diesel. You're deflecting with logistics." I stood there in her doorway, suddenly aware of how tired my legs were. I said, "Okay, let's talk." She sat. I sat. For the next 40 minutes, she explained that she did not feel heard in the relationship. She said I listened in a procedural way, not a loving way. She said my calmness often felt clinical. She said my questions made her feel examined. She said my silence made her feel abandoned. She said my fatigue made her feel deprioritized. I did what she had been asking me to do for months. I listened. No interrupting, no defending, no problem solving. I repeated back what I heard. I validated the emotional experience. I asked what she needed. She said, "I need you to listen more." That was when something in me finally snapped into place, not broke, aligned, because I realized she wasn't asking for listening. I had listened. She was asking for agreement. She wanted me to absorb her interpretation of me without resistance and then perform permanent correction. I said calmly, "I hear that you feel unheard." She nodded, encouraged. I continued, "I also hear that nothing I do counts as listening unless it ends with me accepting your version completely." Her expression changed. "That's not what I said." "No, but it's what happens." Her voice sharpened. "Trevor, this is exactly the defensiveness I'm talking about." I nodded. "Maybe." She blinked. Maybe it was not in the script. I said, "I think I need to go home." Her eyes widened. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "So I'm telling you I feel unheard and your response is to abandon the conversation?" "My response is to stop participating in a conversation where listening means surrender." She stood up. "Wow." Just one word, full of accusation. I picked up my backpack. She said, "If you walk out right now, you're proving my point." I looked at her. That line used to work. If you leave, you prove me right. If you stay, I keep going. A locked room disguised as a moral test. I said, Then I'll prove it quietly. And I left. The air outside felt cold and clean. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before driving. My phone buzzed repeatedly. I didn't look. I drove home, showered, ate cereal from a bowl at midnight, then I slept. The next morning I read the messages. They were exactly what I expected. She said I had stonewalled. She said I had abandoned her during vulnerability. She said my withdrawal was emotionally unsafe. She said she could not keep teaching a grown man how to listen. I read that last sentence 3 times, could not keep teaching. Something about it felt freeing. If she was done teaching, maybe I could be done attending class. So I did something simple. I stopped listening completely. Not in a childish way, not plugging my ears, not ignoring basic logistics. But I stopped being the emotional audience for her endless analysis of my failures. I stopped taking late-night calls after shifts. I stopped reading 12-paragraph texts about impact. I stopped attending conversations that had verdicts built into the first sentence. When she sent a long message, I replied only to the practical part. If there was no practical part, I didn't reply. When she said, "We need to process what happened," I wrote, "I'm not available for that." When she said, "Avoidance won't fix this," I wrote, "I understand." When she sent a voice note, I didn't play it. That one was harder than it sounds. The first unplayed voice note sat there like an emergency light. 23 minutes, then another 14 minutes, then another 31 minutes. Old me would have listened immediately, heart rate up, trying to find the sentence I needed to apologize for. New me looked at them and thought, no one is bleeding, no one is dying, this is not an emergency. That became my rule. If it was not urgent, it did not get emergency access to me. Harper lost her mind. At first, she tried the professional tone. "Trevor, your refusal to engage is a relational rupture." No answer, then softer. "I miss you. I don't want us to become distant." No answer, then anger. "This is cruel. You know silence is my trigger." I almost replied to that, almost. Then I remembered all the times my exhaustion had been her trigger, my questions had been her trigger, my need for sleep had been her trigger, my limits had been her trigger. At some point, a trigger becomes a remote control if the other person is never expected to manage it. I put the phone down. On my next day off, I went hiking alone. Nothing heroic. Just a state park trail with mud, trees, and a river loud enough to drown out thought. For 3 hours, nobody asked me to hold space. Nobody asked if my silence was punishment. Nobody needed me to prove I cared by becoming available on demand. I listened to actual silence. Wind, water, my boots on wet ground. It was the best conversation I'd had in months. When I got back to the car, there were 11 missed calls. Harper, then Callie, then Harper again. One text from Callie said, "Your behavior is emotionally abusive. Call her." I stared at it. Then I blocked Callie. Not Harper, Callie. There are people who enter your relationship only to pour gasoline on language and call it support. She was one of them. That evening, Harper came to my apartment. I had expected it. She knocked hard. When I opened the door, she looked wild in a controlled way, hair tied back, eyes red, jaw tight. She walked in without waiting for an invitation. "Are you serious?" I closed the door. "About what?" This shutdown." I said, "I'm not doing this tonight." She laughed once, sharp. "Of course you're not, because you don't listen." I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, not for drama, because I was thirsty. She followed me. "I have been begging you to listen for months, and now you're punishing me by refusing completely." I set the glass down. "Yes." That stopped her. "What?" "Yes, you asked me to listen more. I listened until listening became a full-time job where I was never off duty, so I stopped." Her mouth opened, closed. She was not prepared for agreement. I continued. "I stopped listening to accusations disguised as needs. I stopped listening to lectures disguised as vulnerability. I stopped listening to your friend's vocabulary coming out of your mouth like a script. I stopped listening because every conversation ended with me smaller and you more certain. Her face flushed. That's a horrible thing to say. It's an honest thing to say. You are being defensive. No, I'm being finished. That word changed the room. Finished. Not upset, not confused, not overwhelmed. Finished. She took a step back. You don't mean that. I do. Her eyes filled. For the first time, the therapist voice disappeared. Trevor, please. Just my name. Just please. It hit me harder than the accusations, because beneath all the language there was a scared person. I could see her, but seeing her did not erase what she had done. She said, I just wanted to feel heard. I nodded. I know. Then why are you doing this? Because I wanted to feel heard too. She stared at me. I said it slowly. You demanded that I listen to every feeling you had about me. But when I said I was exhausted, you heard avoidance. When I said I needed sleep, you heard neglect. When I said a conversation was too much after a shift, you heard abandonment. When I said your words were hurting me, you heard defensiveness. She looked down. I continued. You didn't want listening. You wanted a microphone. That landed hard. Her face twisted. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's accurate. She sat down on the edge of my couch like her legs had given out. The apartment got quiet. I let it. For once, I did not rush to comfort her out of the discomfort she had created. She said very softly, I didn't know you felt like that. I almost believed that. Then I remembered telling her, many times, calmly, carefully, in the right tone, at the right time, using the words she preferred. I said, you didn't know because you weren't listening? She started crying, not loud, not performative, real tears. I felt them pull at me. My old instinct rose immediately. Sit beside her, hand on her back, say it's okay, repair, regulate, rescue. But I stayed where I was, across the room, because I understood something important. Comforting someone can become another way of avoiding the truth. She cried for a while, then asked if we could start over. She said she would do better. She said she had let therapy language bleed into her personal life. She said Callie had been in her head. She said she never meant to make me feel like a client. All of that might have been true, but I had reached the place where truth was no longer enough. Timing matters. A correct apology delivered after the system dies is still an autopsy. I said, I don't want to start over. She looked up. Panic entered her face. Real panic. You can't just end this. I can. After everything? Because of everything? She shook her head. No. We can process this. We can repair. We can make a plan. There it was. Process. Repair. Plan. The language of continuing. I said, Harper, I don't want another conversation about the conversations. She flinched. I love you. That was the first time she had said it in weeks without attaching a need to it. It hurt. I said, I loved you too, past tense. She heard it. Her face collapsed. I sat down then, but not beside her. In the chair, same room, different worlds. I told her I was ending the relationship. I told her I wished her well. I told her I hoped she became as good at hearing partners as she wanted partners to be at hearing her. She cried harder at that. Maybe because it was cruel, maybe because it was true. Usually those are the same sentence when a relationship is dying. She left after an hour. The last thing she said at the door was, I hope one day you learn to listen. Old me would have been wounded by that. New me simply nodded. I hope one day you do too. Then I closed the door, gently, always gently. The silence afterward was enormous, not empty, enormous, like a room with all the furniture removed. I didn't know what to do with it at first. For months, my free time had been filled with emotional debriefings, repair attempts, analysis, clarification, reassurance. Now there was space. At first, space feels like loneliness when you've been trained to confuse chaos with connection. Then your nervous system starts to understand space is not absence. Space is where you come back to yourself. I slept. That was the first miracle. Deep sleep, uninterrupted. No 1 a.m. texts, no calls that began with, "I know you're tired," but no voice notes waiting like unpaid bills. At work, my focus sharpened. My partner on the ambulance, Miguel, noticed. He said, "You seem less haunted." I told him the short version. He listened for 5 minutes and said, "Bro, you already listen to people all day. You don't need to date a podcast with feelings. Crude, accurate." We laughed for the first time in weeks. Harper did not disappear quietly, not immediately. She sent one long email. It was 6 pages if printed. I know because the preview said so. I did not read it. That was my final act of not listening. Not because her words had no value, because I already had all the information I needed. People think closure is hidden inside one last explanation. Usually closure is deciding not to open the next message. A month later, I ran into Adam, Nina's boyfriend from that dinner. He was at a gas station of all places. He recognized me and gave the awkward nod men give when they share a trauma but not a friendship. We talked for a minute. He asked if Harper and I were still together. I said no. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Good for you." I asked how he was. He looked toward his car. Nina was inside on the phone. He said, "Listening." That one word told me enough. I hope he figured it out. I really do. People can turn "listen to me" into a cage so slowly that you don't notice the door closing. You think you're being patient. You think you're being mature. You think this is what emotional intelligence looks like. Then one day you realize every conversation has become a courtroom, every feeling is evidence, and somehow you're always the defendant. I heard through a mutual friend that Harper took the breakup badly. She apparently told people I had become avoidant and emotionally unavailable. Maybe that is true from her angle. People always narrate from the wound that protects their pride. But the same friend also said Harper stopped using the phrase, "men don't listen," so casually. She started saying people struggle to listen. Small change, maybe meaningless, maybe not. I hope it meant something. I don't hate her. That would require carrying her around. I don't want to carry her. I carried enough. I think Harper wanted intimacy but only knew how to create evaluation. I think she wanted to be heard so badly that she forgot listening had to go both ways. I think therapy language gave her beautiful tools, and fear taught her to use them like knives. That is sad. It is also not my responsibility to bleed while she learns gentleness. Months later, I went back to that same bookstore cafe, rainy again, same long table, different shift behind me. No dramatic reason, I just wanted coffee. For a second, I remembered her there with the pen behind her ear, asking if Long Night had a story behind it. It did. Now it had an ending. I sat by the window and drank my coffee in peace. A woman at the next table was talking loudly on the phone about a work conflict. For a moment, my body prepared itself. The old reflex: listen, assess, prepare a response. Then I realized she was not talking to me. Not my emergency, not my repair, not my room to hold. I went back to my coffee. That was freedom, not revenge, not victory, just the ability to let someone else's noise remain someone else's noise. Harper demanded that I listen more, so I did. I listened to her words, her tone, her patterns. The way every boundary I set became harm, the way every need I had became avoidance, the way every conversation ended with her more centered and me more erased. I listened until I understood the message beneath all the language. Only one of us was allowed to be heard. Once I heard that clearly, I stopped listening completely. And that was when she finally heard me. Not because I explained better, not because I found the perfect words, but because silence removed the audience, and without an audience, a monologue has nowhere to go. So she lost it. Not because I became cruel, because I became unavailable for the role she had mistaken for love. I still listen for a living. I listen to pain, to breath, to fear, to the small details that decide what happens next. But I no longer confuse listening with surrender. I no longer hand my nervous system to someone who calls it communication. And I no longer stay in relationships where my only job is to absorb impact reports from a person who never once checks whether I survived the impact. Sometimes the healthiest thing a man can do is stop explaining, stop processing, stop proving he heard every word, and finally listen to the quiet part of himself that has been saying the same thing for months. Leave.